everyone, today we will learn about Kant's categorical imperative and his theory of right. But before we tackle about the categorical imperative, we need to know first the concept of human person because it is the foundation of understanding the categorical imperative. In fact, for Kant, the human person as a rational moral agent is the sole basis of determining the truth of the categorical imperative. With this, we suppose that the ultimate goal of Kant's moral teaching is for the human person to become morally perfect. For this reason, we need to discuss first the anthropological basis of Kant's categorical imperative before we delve into its specificity. So, are you ready? And so, how does Kant view the human person? According to Kant, human person has twofold nature. The homo nomenon, which nomenon means the thing in itself, and the other is homo phenomenon, in which phenomenon is very familiar to us because we usually heard it like in the news or the TV, right, etc. So now we move on to the discussion between the difference between the two. Nomenon for Kant cannot be known because, as the essence of the thing, it is beyond experience. For example, this ball pen. What we see in this ball pen is its physical appearance. From its physical appearance, color blue, and short, and of course, it is used for writing. We know for a fact that this is the characteristic of a ball pen. However, nomenon suggests that we must know beyond rather what we know for a fact. So there is a question, what makes a ball pen really a ball pen? That confuses you, right? So to put it simply, nomenon is something deeper than what we normally see with our own eyes. It is not about the texture, color, and the shape, but it is about how all these characteristics binded as one in order to classify it or in order to categorize it. If we apply the concept to us humans, homo nomenon is the godlike of ourself. It is the human person's real self. According to Kant, it is our real self. Again, it is our real self. Homo nomenon is our real self, or our godlike self. But there is again a question: how do we attain this? How do we achieve our godlike self? For Kant, we cannot actualize our godlike self by developing ourselves into moral persons. How? By obeying the command of the categorical imperative. But we cannot actualize ourselves if we don't know ourselves, right? So how do we know ourselves? Phenomenal self can provide us the key. Phenomenon for Kant refers to the thing as it appears to the observers. In other words, in the empirical part of a thing, it is the empirical part of the thing, a part of a thing that can be experienced by human. What we know for a fact, or what we know that are obviously, are the so-called phenomenal aspect. So what we know for a fact and what we know obviously are the so-called phenomenal aspect. And these differentiate phenomenon from nomenon. However, Kant stated that everything that exists has two natures, namely the non-empirical part, or the nomenon or essence, and the empirical part, which refers to phenomenon. Now, since the human person cannot know her nominal self, then he must take into account that we have a phenomenal self. Thus, it is the empirical representation of the nominal self. Therefore, it serves as the springboard for the actualization of the nominal self. Now, the main problem of our phenomenal self is it always appeals to our desire, which according to Kant is the source of errors. So desires, according to Kant, results error. And so the phenomenal self must be guided by our moral principle, based on our reason. As Tucker argues, The nominal self tries to actualize its godlike nature as the real self by obeying the dictate of reason through the categorical imperative. Now we proceed on Kant's notion of morality. Discussion of human person implies that the phenomenal self has to grapple with desires and take heed of reason to actualize our godlike nature. However, the phenomenal self usually violates the dictate of reason and succumbs to our desire or inclinations. Thus, the desire of the nominal self to attain moral perfection is impeded. Impeded means to slow action or the movement or the progress. In order to understand better, we will take the most common example, cheating in school. So, as we all know, cheating in school is very rampant, especially in universities, high school, and for whatever purpose it is, cheating in school is unreasonable and morally unacceptable. But because of the desire to pass an entrance examination and be accepted in the college of choice, or the desire to keep the financial aid from scholarships, or the desire to graduate, students resort to cheating on examination and on academic papers or projects. Students who cheat may not immediately recognize that their actions are morally wrong because they are blinded by their justifications. They fail to take into consideration the far-reaching implication of giving to their desire. It is just like, example, bata pa ka, nanguha ka kwarta sa imong parents, and then, gamay ra na siya nga amount. Pagkadako ka, murag maana na kang manguhag kwarta. So, para nimo, it is right. Well, in fact, it is not right. So, it will cause a bigger problem later on. Kant asserts that human action must be guided by a moral principle, rooted in reason. Thus, Kant formulated the categorical imperative to serve as a guide in determining whether an action is morally right or wrong, and therefore categorical imperatives serve as the ultimate rational principle of morality. Again, categorical imperative serve as the ultimate rational principle of morality. And so, what is Kant's view of morality? Morality for Kant is the strict obedience to the categorical imperative. It entails a commitment to the absolute command that is an obligation to the law as such. In this connection, Kant say, and I quote, "Everyone must admit that law, if it is to hold morally, let's say for example as the ground of obligation, we must imply it with absolute necessity." As a conclusion, Kant believes that if and only when the human person acts in accordance with the absolute command that she can claim her actions to be morally right. That's all. Thank you.
A priori principle and a posteriori principle. A priori principle is based on knowledge or concept that can be known as independent of experience. The statement, "all bachelors are unmarried," is a very common example of a priori principle. So we don't need to ask the bachelors if he or she is married, because we all know for a fact that a bachelor is not married. But it must be noted that although we don't need to experience a certain circumstance for us to gain knowledge, knowledge may still arise in relation to experience. For example, we all know that the whole is greater than its parts, and that is an example of a priori knowledge. So we don't need to experience we don't need to experience something for us to conclude that the whole is greater than its part. Through mental processes or cognition, we can therefore conclude that the whole is greater than its part. However, such knowledge, according to Kant, is in relation to experience because we need to experience what a whole is or what a part is before we can conclude that the whole is greater than its part. In fact, all knowledge begins with experience, and there is no doubt about that. Our faculty of cognition is awakened into exercise, which will affect our senses and will in turn produce representations. It will also arouse our powers to understand a certain activity and allow us to compare, to connect, or to separate these, and so to convert materials into a knowledge of objects, which is now then called experience. Therefore, no knowledge of us is antecedent to our experience. Let us move on to posteriori knowledge. According to Kant, posteriori knowledge can only be known through experience. Let us take, for example, this statement: the food is delicious. So, in that case, we need to experience eating that food for us to conclude that the food is delicious. And since posteriori knowledge is dependent to experience, according to Kant, cannot become a form or a basis of morality, mainly because people experience different circumstances and they vary, and a certain circumstance vary from one person to another, so they have different interpretations relative to their experience. And since morality should be binding among all rational beings, then morality should be based on a universal truth, and that is on a priori knowledge. Let us move on with the concept of practical reason as the foundation of morality. Kant continues to assert that morality should be based on a priori, and the principle is determined through reason. According to philosophers, humans who are acting morally tantamount to those human beings that are acting in accordance with reason. According to Kant, there are two-dimensional view of reason. But Kant is not referring by two-dimensionals as two kinds of reason, but rather he draws a fine line of distinction between those two employment of reasons. Employments of reasons are speculative, or also known as theoretical, and the second one is practical. According to Kant, speculative or theoretical employment of reason is determining what it is or what exists, while for practical employment of reason, it determines what ought to exist or what ought to be. According to Kant, speculative reasons make it possible for a human person to attain knowledge about an object. Hence, its outcome is called cognition. For speculative reasons or speculative employment of reason, it manifests the process of making or process of thinking, making inferences, or drawing conclusions based on the senses. In fact, the whole process of employing speculative reasons begins with sensation, which will in turn proceeds to understanding and the end as a reason, and ends with reason. According to Kant, he believes that the ultimate end reason for human beings is to attain full understanding of the totality of the natural world. Thus, human person tries to understand what is behind all the things around them, or everything about it, and establishes the interconnectedness of cognition as the person attempts to understand the totality of the way things are. However, a complete understanding of the world cannot be attained by employment of speculative reason alone. This is because there are higher levels of concepts that the human person has to determine knowledge of, such as the concept of God, immortality, and freedom. From this contention, it can be understood why Kant says that although our knowledge begins with the senses and ends with speculative reason, beyond that, nothing higher can be discovered in the human mind. For elaborating the matter of intuition and subjecting it to the highest unity of thought. Thus, Kant deemed it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make a room for faith. By this statement, Kant believes that the human person has to deny deny the reach of speculative reason beyond the limits of senses and experience, and make room for another employment of reason which is called faith, and make room for another employment of reason that is not concerned with the determination of an object from senses, but with the production of an object corresponding to ideas. In this case, Kant is not only making a room for faith, but also for practical reason. According to Kant, the practical reasons begins with principle and proceeds with understanding, and finally to the senses. Hence, practical reason manifests the human person's acceptance of certain concepts such as principles, certain concepts as principles that ought to exist. And basically, you have to act in accordance with it. With practical reasons, human person has to think and act rationally in order for them to know the totality of the world. In other words, practical reasons deals with the grounds in determining the will of the human person to think and act with regards to the world. From this distinction, we can therefore conclude that speculative reason cannot become a basis for morality because it cannot be universal, for it only deals with cognition, which is relative to one's experience only. Thus, nothing can be ascribed as the foundation of morality, but through practical reasons. According to Kant, only reasons in its practical use leads to an absolute necessity and universal law of action of rational beings. This is because all rational beings shares practical reason and apply particular or general principles to a particular circumstance. This means that practical reasons does not vary from perspective of one person to another. This goes to say that when practical reason dictates that one person should act in a certain way, in a certain manner, in a particular situation, then of course any person who is confronted with the same situation will eventually act in the same manner. Indeed, practical reasons serves as the guide principles of moral actions. Thus, for Kant, human persons are deemed as acting morally only when they act rationally based on practical reasons.
Good day. I'm gonna be reporting about goodwill. So, in Kant's view, the morality of an action should not be determined by its outcome. This is because consequences of action cannot hold a universal truth. For me, human persons do not have full control over the outcome of their actions. It is inevitable that at times, even when the human persons acts rationally accordance with the practical reasons, she does not achieve the intended outcome due to some uncontrollable circumstances. Moreover, if the morality of an action is to be based on its intended, the morality becomes conditional. In other words, the goodness of a thing or act is conditioned in one's intended end. The Kantian ethics is in stark opposition to the moral theories of consequentialists who condition the morality of an action on its end or outcome. There are many things that may appear as good but are not truly intrinsically good. Kant's point here is that if something is good without qualification, that something is not merely good as means to one end and bad in another. Rather, it is absolutely good in itself and universally good in every instant. The moral worth of action is determined only by the motive or the will that is behind the action. As already known, all those things or actions that people think of as good can become extremely worse if the will to make use of them is bad. Therefore, if actions are to be good, the will doing such must be good. the concept of duty as the motive behind moral actions. In the previous section, action has moral worth only when the human person is acting out of a good will. But when can the human person claim that she definitely possesses a good will that governs her moral actions? According to Kant, the human person is said to be acting out of good will only when the sole impetus of her action is that of moral obligation or moral duty. Hence, for Kant, duty is motive behind a moral act. It follows, therefore, that an action is said to have moral worth when the human person performs such action only because she recognizes through practical reason that it is morally the right to do in a given situation. And as a rational and moral being, she regarded herself as having a moral obligation or moral duty to do such right action. Now, in the discussion of duty, it is important to understand the difference between acting for the sake of duty and acting in accordance with the duty. On the other hand, acting in accordance with the duty means acting simple to conform the law. To fully understand this distinction, let us take into consideration Kant's famous example, which is to preserve one's life is a duty to, and besides, everyone has also a direct inclination to do so. Let us use this statement in interpreting the moral worth of the act of preserving the life of a fetus. For instance, if the human person preserves the life of a fetus because she recognizes that it is what the moral law dictates and understands that it is her duty to do so, then she is acting for the sake of duty. However, if the human person acts in accordance with the duty, her action of preserving the life of the fetus is simply to obey the moral law and appear as a responsible parent or avoid the possible legal implication and the associated stigma in the event that she resorts to abortion. But Kant is not saying that an action done in accordance with duty is wrong because it still conforms that the law. For Kant, action can only have moral worth when it is performed out of something good without qualification, and that is out of goodwill, which is then manifested in doing actions for the sake of duty. Hence, the motive of any moral action must be duty, not desires.
So the next topic is Kant's moral law, the categorical imperative. So let us recall that Kant believes that the human person possesses a nominal self that is a godlike in nature. So the human person has a duty to actualize her godlike self by becoming morally perfect. So, because the human person also has a sensuous phenomenal self that is susceptible to desires or inclination, that human person has to recognize her obligation or duty to resist these inclinations for her to fully attain moral perfection. So, according to Ross 2009, it is for this reason that Kant conceived of a moral law that should prevail over the inclinations of the sensuous self and guide the human person in achieving moral perfection. It is important to understand Kant's conception of the moral law, but in contrast to St. Thomas Aquinas, who believed that the moral law is derived from the natural law, which originates from God's eternal law. So, in contradiction to this concept, Kant believes that the source of the moral law is not God, but the human person himself. Now, because the human person is a rational being, the source of Kant's moral law, therefore, is nothing but practical reason. So, Kant formulated that the moral law based on the principles of practical reasoning that apply to all rational human persons, irrespective of their desires or inclinations. This means that the human person should do what is right, as prescribed by reason, which all rational beings are bound to accept. Thus, it can be concluded that Kant attaches the criteria of absolute necessity and strict universality to the moral law. from the fact that it is absolutely binding and does not accept any exceptions, and at the same time directs how human persons ought to act. Kant calls this moral law the categorical imperative. So for Kant, it is an absolute law, for there is only one absolute statement of the categorical imperative. However, Kant argues further that categorical imperative can be formulated in another way to make the moral law more understandable. In this connection, let us briefly discuss two of Kant's official formulations of the categorical imperative. Kant's first and fundamental formulation of the categorical imperative is based on the principle of universality. So it states that act only on the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So a maxim, according to Kant, is the principle on which the moral agent acts, or simply put, the principle of actions. So in the first formulation of Kant, is saying that after the human person determines a principle of action or maxim, she must ask herself or himself whether it is possible for everyone to act in accordance with the maxim. If it is possible for everyone to act according to that maxim, then it is morally acceptable. Otherwise, it is morally unacceptable. In the first maxim, a person ought to think for others, to be selfless of his act, but to think in universality and for the good of all, not just for oneself. Like, for example, in this instance, let us consider that the maxim of lying to save a relationship. So obviously, such maxim may be acceptable only to the person who lies, and not everyone can consider the act of lying as acceptable. For this reason, the act of lying is never morally acceptable because it fails to satisfy the principle of universality. The second formulation to Kant's categorical imperative states that, so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, never as a means but always as an end. This formulation of the categorical imperative is based on the principle of humanity. This simply means that the categorical imperative dictates that rational beings must treat each other as ends in themselves and never as a means to some further end. So this is because we use another rational being merely as a means to a further end. Then we have reduced that rational being into a thing. In the same example of lying in the first formulation, lying to save a relationship, it is clear that it involves manipulating the other person, which makes her less of a rational human being. In this sense, we can say that it violates the principles of humanity. So for this reason, according to Kant, lying is not morally acceptable even if it is intended to save a relationship. So lastly, according to Macaulay 1976, Kant is conceived that the employment of the categorical imperative as a guide to moral actions would ultimately lead to the actualizations of a morally perfect community, which he calls a kingdom of ends. And so Kant envisions this community as one where rational beings are acting with reverence to the moral law and regard human persons as ends in themselves. And so, in this way, human persons are existing in perfect harmony as they respect the humanity of all its members.
So the next topic would be a brief sketch about Kant's theory of rights. So the categorical imperative is an absolute commandment that is binding to all human persons. He insisted that this bindness is self-imposed. This means that the human person is autonomously prescribed the moral laws of herself that govern her actions. In other words, although the categorical imperative is a universal law, the human person has the freedom to choose whether or not to obey the moral law of action. The idea of freedom or free will derive from the notion that the human person is a rational being who possesses the faculty of practical reasoning. So, as it has been discussed in the previous section, practical person is a governor of the will. As a rational being who exercises a practical reasoning, the human person can freely choose which laws to adopt and impose in her life. Because the human person aims to attain moral perfection by virtue of autonomy, it can surmise that she freely wills to obey the dictates of categorical imperative. Anytime she is put in a situation wherein the choices of action need careful deliberation. So the idea of freedom will here leads us to the conceptual of right. So now for Kant's right, that is a moral claim to the recognized by others as a right-bearing person. It's intrinsically related to morality. So Kant's categorical imperative, which is the original conceived as an ethical theory. So every action by itself or by its maxim enables the freedom of each to coexist with the freedom of everyone else is accordance with the universal law is right. So this is the quote of Kant. As we can see, Kant outlines his theory of right in accordance of freedom. So the freedom is in the soul of original right, and with this conception of original right, Kant was able to formulate the concept of human rights, which now includes the right of life, the right to be independent, and the right to express one's own thoughts and opinion. In short, freedom of expression. So Kant distinguishes two kinds of right, namely the natural right and acquired right. So the idea of freedom as originally belonged to the first. Kant called this as an internal right, but for Kant, the conceptual of freedom as original right opens the way to acquired right. Kant calls this external right. So for the conclusion, show that the Kantian ethics is aimed at the realization of the godlike self of the human person. However, it must be noted that Kantian ethics is not theological but deontological. That is, the morality of a human act is based not on the consequence but on rules or duty. So the discussion also showed that the foundation of Kantian ethics is a practical reason. Practical reason serves as the guiding principle of moral actions. It compels human persons, the rational being, to engage in moral reason in determining the right action. Thus, for Kant, human persons are deemed as acting morally only when they act rationally based on a practical reason. And finally, we have learned that we can decide from Kant's categorical imperative the concept of right. Thus, freedom is our original right, that is, we have the right to freedom by virtue of our humanity. And Kant was able to formulate the concept of human rights, which now includes the right to life, the right to be independent, and the right to express one's own thoughts and opinions.